Ah, hello there. Very pleased that you could make it. As you know, I'm a wargamer, and that means certain things. It means I do things in the traditional way, which means I only get my miniatures from the finest stockists in England and have them shipped across the pond to me via tramp steamer. It means that I paint those miniatures in only the proper colored regalia, and look down my nose at those who don't do their research. It means I listen to only period music and eschew that rock and roll that the callow youth of today seem so enamored with. Above all, though, it means I comport myself at all times with the utmost dignity and class. So it has always been, and by Neptune's trident, so it should always be.
Dad!
Yes, Sugar Dumpling?
A package came for you in the mail. It says it's a 3D printer.
What's this? Welcome to Little Wars TV. I'm Steve. 6 months ago, I did something that completely changed my outlook and approach to the hobby of historical miniatures wargaming. I bought a 3D printer. I've actually been watching the 3D printing technology for a number of years now, but didn't buy a 3D printer simply because they were too expensive and reliability was a real concern. Over the course of the last year or so, however, prices have steadily dropped and reports on reliability were much improved. So finally I decided to take the plunge. Since a big part of what we do here at Little Wars TV is show you our tips and tricks for the hobby, as I've gotten comfortable using my 3D printer and done some pretty incredible things with it, I knew that I wanted to share it with all of you. And so this is the first in a multi-part series all about 3D printing for the historical miniatures wargamer. Before we dive in though, I want to make two things perfectly clear. One, if you've already got a 3D printer or are very familiar with 3D printing technology, this series isn't really for you. It's really a basic level series for those who know nothing about 3D printing. There are much better sources out there if you already have a ton of experience. Second, this series is going to be pretty talky. Even though I'm going to try and simplify things as much as possible, the fact is we're going to have to talk about some technical details, and that's never all that entertaining, but I do hope that it's helpful. Before I get to those details though, you may be wondering, why should I care or be interested in getting into 3D printing in the first place? Well, let me answer your question with one of my own. How would you like to, in your home, on your schedule, take spools of 2.75mm diameter plastic like this and turn it into all the types of things you see here? That's right, I've printed up everything you see here on this table on my printer. Everything from movement templates to 6mm tanks, walls, and temples to 15mm buildings and vehicles up to that massive 28mm church. And every single one of these models just started as digital files and strings of plastic. The bottom line is, no matter what period of history you game or what scale you game in, you will be able to find digital files out there that you can print up and use in your games. And if you can't find files that you like, but you're comfortable learning a little bit of 3D modeling software, you can create your own. That's what I did, and I had no background in 3D modeling whatsoever. Yet now I've designed things like this 6mm Parthenon, this Japanese house, and these 6mm ancient walls inspired by Greg's paper wall system for use with our rule set Age of Hannibal. And I mentioned cheaply, right? While there's certainly an initial investment in buying the printer in the first place, and I'll talk about some of your options there in my next episode, once you get that set up, you're really only looking at paying for the plastic itself, which is called filament, and as I mentioned earlier, comes in spools. Now the kind of filament that I use is called PLA from a company called Solutech, and it runs me, depending on color, anywhere from $15 to $17 for a kilogram, so over 2 pounds of the stuff. Now you may be wondering, how much can you make with a kilogram of this filament? Well, you could print up 2 of these 6mm Parthenons with plenty of filament left on the spool. Or you could print up 2 of these 28mm warehouses, again with plenty left on the spool. Perhaps even better yet, you could print up 35 or more of these 15mm Panzer IVs. Your next questions might be, how do 3D printers work And how tech savvy do you need to be in order to add this as another aspect of your historical wargaming hobby? As to the first question, how do they work? Well, there tend to be two types of consumer 3D printers out there. FDM printers, FDM stands for Fused Deposit Modeling, and resin printers, which actually use a number of different technologies, but all basically create the model out of a pool of liquid resin. FDM printers, which are what I use, tend to be cheaper and easier to use. Resin printers are generally more expensive than their FDM counterparts and tend to require a little bit more post-processing work after the print is complete in order to make it usable. That being said, the real advantage of resin printers is the amount of detail you can get on your models is stunning. Now, since I only own and use FDM printers, that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. But before I get into talking a little bit more detail about how FDM printers work, both resin and FDM printers do construct the models in a similar way, in the sense that they build them layer upon layer upon layer. And those layers can be very, very thin. On an FDM printer, those layers are typically going to be about 1/10 of a millimeter to 2/10 of a millimeter thick. So, as you can imagine, even a small model that may be only 20 millimeters high is still going to include a lot of layers. Focusing in on the FDM printers in a little bit more detail on how they work, the plastic filament, which is about 2.75 millimeters wide, is either pulled or pushed into a heating block, which has a nozzle on the bottom. In that heating block, the plastic melts and then exits through that nozzle at a uniform rate. While this is going on, motors on the side or top of your printer are moving that heating and nozzle assembly back and forth, side to side, up and down along the X, Y, and Z axis. So as the molten plastic comes out, it's laid down in the pattern that it needs to be in order to construct that model. As each layer is laid down, it actually cools very fast, so by the time it's ready to go to the next layer, it lays on top of a solid base. If all that sounds complicated, the fact is, it really isn't. It's motors and pulleys and a heating block. And the great thing is, you don't need to do anything with it, other than pretty much, for the most part, just hit start. Honestly, the hardest part about 3D printing is the waiting, because this is not a fast process. As I said, we're talking about hundreds of layers here, if not thousands on really big models. And each one of those layers can take a minute or multiple minutes to lay down. So do the math, and pretty soon you're talking about hours and hours and hours for models. Now, the nice thing about that is once you hit that start button and get the print started, you can wander off and do something else. So how about that other question? Just how tech savvy do you need to be to use a 3D printer? Well, the real truthful answer mechanically is a lot of that's going to depend on what printer you buy. Some are just more finicky than others. But in any case, generally speaking, if you can loosen or tighten some small screws, you should be fine for doing the assembly and maintenance on your printer. For most, the probably more bewildering or complex part of this is actually going to be the part that's done on your computer. And that's creating a digital file that the 3D printer can use to build these models. The most common file format used for models intended for 3D printing is called STL. The problem is 3D printers don't actually read STL files. They read a different type of file, which is called a G-code file. So how is it then that you take an STL file that you download and convert it into a G-code file that your printer can actually understand? Well, you're going to have to actually use some software that's specifically designed for exactly that purpose. This kind of software is called a slicer. The name is pretty obvious. You're taking a 3D model and cutting it into many, many, many slices or layers and telling a printer how to create that model. Now, most printers come with a slicer software that you can download once you receive your printer and use that. There are also, if yours doesn't come with one, or if you don't like the one that your printer comes with, there are also two very commonly used, very powerful slicer software packages out there which you can download for free. They're called Slicer, with the E actually being a 3, and Cura. And most slicer software, as long as you use a fairly mainstream 3D printer, you're going to be able to either designate your printer during setup or pick it from a drop-down menu, and a lot of your settings are going to be preset for you. That's a good thing because there are a lot of settings in these slicer softwares, and it's can be overwhelming, to be perfectly honest, and most of them I still don't even know exactly what they do. But the good thing is you really only have to know about 6 of them to really be able to dial in your printer, close to its maximum potential. In a future episode of this series, I'll explore those 6 settings in a little bit of detail to help you get started. For all of the other settings, generally there are a lot of users out there, and many of them have done all of the experimenting and tweaking that is necessary to get you some really, really good results. And they put these out there in either lists where you can enter manually or electronic profiles that you can load into your slicer, and it'll make all the setting adjustments for you. It takes a little bit of work and maybe takes a little bit of figuring out, but once you do, things are really, really easy. You can go from STL file to printing on your printer incredibly fast, usually with just the press of a button or two. And I'm not kidding or bragging when I say I can take an STL file, convert it to a G-code, put it on an SD card, and bring it up to my printer in about 30 seconds. Now, perhaps the best part about all of this is even once you print something up, even once you've taken the STL file, converted it into a G-code, put it in your printer, printed it up, and you have it sitting there in your hand, guess what? You still have the STL and G-code files, which means you could print up another one, or a third, or a fourth, or 100 of them. You could have, 1,000 of these little 15mm Panzer IVs if you really need 1,000 15mm Panzer IVs for some reason. Perhaps even better yet is at that slicer step, even though it seems like it's an onerous duty to have to convert it from one file to another, that's actually a good thing. Because when you put your STL file into that slicer, you can change the size of the file. So even though it's designed as, say, a 28mm scale building, when you put it in the slicer, you can shrink that file, turn it into a 15mm scale building, or 10, or actually any scale you want. You can increase the size too. So not only do you have endless numbers of models that you can print them all in different sizes if you like. I think that's good for this introductory video here today. Hopefully I've done 2 things. 1, I hope I've gotten you excited about the potential 3D printing has to change your approach to your historical wargaming hobby. 2nd, I hope I've at least gotten you interested enough that you'll tune in next time for the next episode of this 3D printing series, when I plan to be talking about selecting the right 3D printer for you if you're thinking it might be time to take the leap. See you then.